Samurai Code explained why the Bushido spirit defined Japan for 7 centuries. The night before honor. It is late evening in feudal Japan. A thin wind slides through the pine trees, carrying the quiet hiss of bamboo leaves brushing together in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rings once. Slow, heavy and thoughtful, the kind of sound that makes you pause for a moment and wonder if time itself just sighed. Inside a dim wooden hall, a lone samurai kneels. His armor rests neatly beside him, lacquered plates stacked like the shell of some patient iron insect. A small oil lamp flickers near the floor, throwing nervous shadows across the tatami mats. In front of him sits a short blade, not a weapon for battle, a weapon for something else entirely. Because tonight, this man is preparing to die. Not in the chaos of war, not beneath a hail of arrows, not even at the hands of an enemy. No, tonight he will take his own life. Calmly, deliberately, with ceremony. Because according to the strange and uncompromising philosophy that guided the samurai for centuries, death, when done properly, could actually be the most honorable act of all. And if you're thinking that sounds slightly insane, well, you're not alone. But this mindset, this quiet acceptance of death, was the beating heart of something called Bushido, the way of the warrior. For roughly 700 years, this philosophy shaped Japan's politics, culture, military, and social order. It governed not only how samurai fought, but how they lived, how they spoke, how they served their masters, and occasionally how they died. Hollywood often portrays samurai as noble swordsmen, wandering through misty forests, delivering wise speeches about honor before gracefully defeating their enemies, which is charming, but also wildly incomplete. Because the real Bushido was far less romantic and far more unsettling. It was a system that demanded absolute loyalty, emotional suppression, ritualized violence, and a near-obsessive meditation on death. Imagine a society where the ideal human being is someone who has already mentally accepted their own death every single morning before breakfast. Yes, that was basically the starting point. And strangely enough, this philosophy didn't just create great warriors. It created bureaucrats, administrators, tax collectors, government officials. Because over time, the samurai, Japan's warrior elite, transformed from battlefield fighters into the ruling class of the country. They governed villages, managed law courts, collected taxes, and wrote philosophical treatises about how best to suppress personal emotion in favor of duty, which is exactly as relaxing as it sounds. But to understand how Bushido shaped Japan for 7 centuries, we need to travel backward, far before the calm rituals and philosophical texts, back to a time when Japan was not peaceful at all. A time when the islands were fragmented, violent, and constantly fighting. Back to the birth of the samurai. When Japan was a patchwork of war. If you walked through Japan around the 9th or 10th century, you wouldn't see a unified nation. You'd see a patchwork of local warlords, provincial clans, and powerful families, all competing for influence. The imperial court in Kyoto technically rules the country. Technically, but in reality, the emperor's authority outside the capital was, let's say, flexible. Local landowners controlled most of the countryside, and they needed protection. Bandits roamed the roads, rival clans raided farmland, and political disputes often escalated into full-blown violence, which created demand for a very specific type of professional. A man who could ride a horse, shoot a bow, swing a sword, and most importantly, stay loyal. These men became known as samurai. The word itself comes from the verb saburawu, which roughly means to serve. At first, samurai were not mystical warrior philosophers. They were basically hired muscle for wealthy landowners, armed escorts, bodyguards, enforcers. If a rival family decided to seize your rice fields, you didn't send them a polite letter. You sent men with arrows, and those men were the early samurai. But even in this early stage, something interesting began to develop. These warriors started building reputations not just for fighting ability, but for loyalty. Because in a world of shifting alliances and betrayals, loyalty was extremely valuable. A lord needed warriors who would not run away in battle. Warriors who would not switch sides if offered slightly better rice rations. And slowly, over generations, a cultural expectation formed. A samurai's worth was measured by his devotion to his master, not by wealth, not by comfort, by loyalty. And if that loyalty meant dying, well, that was simply part of the job description. Which brings us to one of the most famous events in early samurai history, the Genpei War. The war that changed everything. In the late 12th century, two massive clans began fighting for control of Japan, the Taira and the Minamoto. Now, if you've ever watched historical dramas, you know that when two giant warrior families start competing for power, things tend to escalate quickly, and escalate they did. The Genpei War lasted from 1180 to 1185, 5 years of brutal conflict. Battles across mountains, rivers, and coastlines, entire armies clashing in dramatic cavalry charges while archers filled the sky with arrows. If you imagine thousands of armored warriors shouting across misty valleys while banners flap violently in the wind, you're not far off. It was chaotic, it was bloody, and it fundamentally reshaped Japan. Because when the war finally ended, the Minamoto clan emerged victorious. Their leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, did something revolutionary. Instead of trying to replace the emperor, he created a new system of government, a military government, the shogunate. The emperor still existed, but real power now belonged to the shogun, the military ruler supported by the samurai class. And just like that, the warriors of Japan went from hired swords to the political backbone of the country, which meant something else had to evolve too: their identity. If samurai were going to run the nation, they needed more than combat skills. They needed a philosophy, a code, something that explained why these sword-wielding professionals deserved authority over everyone else. And this is where Bushido slowly began to shape. The philosophy of accepting death. Centuries later, a samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo would write something rather striking. The way of the warrior finds in death. Not victory, not glory, death. Now, at first glance, that sounds slightly alarming, but the idea behind it was strangely practical. If a warrior constantly fears death, he hesitates. Hesitation gets people killed. But if a warrior has already accepted death, fully, calmly, completely, then fear loses its power. He becomes decisive, focused, unshakable, in theory at least. So samurai were encouraged to imagine their own death daily in battle, in accidents, in ritualized suicide. They rehearsed these possibilities mentally so that when danger arrived, it would not feel unfamiliar. It's a bit like psychological armor. And yes, it is also a little unsettling. But this mindset, this quiet acceptance of death, was the beating heart of something called extreme discipline. Samurai were expected to control their emotions, anger, fear, desire, even happiness sometimes, because personal feelings could distract from duty, and duty was everything. If your lord commanded you to defend a castle, you defended it, even if you knew the battle was hopeless, even if survival was unlikely, even if the enemy army outnumbered you 10-1, you stayed. The birth of the Bushido Code. Somewhere in medieval Japan, long before the philosophy of Bushido was neatly written into scrolls or quoted by later historians, a samurai sits quietly in a temple garden. The morning air is cool and faintly damp. Mist curls lazily through the stones and moss. A bamboo fountain tips forward with a hollow clack, spills water, then slowly lifts again. Clack. Silence returns. The warrior sits cross-legged on the wooden veranda, staring into the garden, not speaking, not moving. His sword rests beside him, its polished surface catching the pale gray light of dawn. For several minutes, nothing happens, which, strangely enough, is exactly the point. Because sometime between the endless clan wars and the rise of the shoguns, the samurai began borrowing ideas from philosophers and monks. Ideas that had nothing to do with battlefield tactics and everything to do with mastering the mind. Warriors, after all, spend a lot of time waiting before battle, waiting in castles, waiting in silence while political decisions unfold beyond their control. And if you give a person with a sword too much idle time, they usually start thinking about uncomfortable things like fear, ambition, anger, revenge. So the samurai did what many practical people do when confronted with uncomfortable emotions. They turned to philosophy. And in Japan, two major intellectual traditions happened to be available: Zen Buddhism and Confucianism. Together, these two philosophies quietly molded what would eventually become the Bushido Code. Not through dramatic declarations, but through centuries of slow cultural absorption. The kind of philosophical seepage that happens when monks, scholars, and warriors spend long evenings arguing over tea. Or sake. Probably both. Zen and the samurai mind. Zen Buddhism arrived in Japan from China sometime around the 12th century, carried by monks who believed enlightenment could be achieved through meditation, discipline, and direct personal experience rather than endless scripture reading, which made it surprisingly appealing to samurai, because warriors, generally speaking, are not famous for enjoying long theological debates. But the Zen approach was different. Sit still. Observe your thoughts, let them pass. Detach from fear, detach from desire. Accept the present moment exactly as it is. And eventually, clarity emerges. If that sounds suspiciously like a mental training program for soldiers, well, you're not wrong. Zen taught warriors how to calm their minds before combat. A samurai archer drawing a bow could not afford trembling hands. A swordsman facing an opponent could not afford hesitation. Even a moment of doubt could be fatal. Zen meditation helped eliminate that hesitation. The goal was a mental state sometimes described as mushin, no mind. Not empty exactly, but free from distraction. When a swordsman reached this state, actions happened instinctively, smoothly, without conscious overthinking. The blade moved, the body responded, and the mind remained quiet. It sounds mystical, but in practice, it was simply intense mental discipline, the kind developed through long hours of meditation, breathing exercises, and quiet observation, and occasionally through rather blunt teaching methods. Zen masters were not known for gentle encouragement. If a student asked a philosophical question, the answer might come in the form of a riddle, or shout, or, in some cases, a sudden smack with a bamboo stick. Because, of course it did. The idea was to break the student's attachment to logical thinking and force a sudden flash of insight. Not exactly a comfortable educational environment, but surprisingly effective for training warriors who needed calm focus under pressure. Over time, many samurai adopted Zen practices as part of daily life. Meditation before dawn, quiet reflection after battle, poetry writing, tea ceremonies. Yes, poetry. The same warriors who could cut down enemies in combat sometimes spent evenings composing delicate verses about autumn leaves drifting across a river. Human beings are complicated like that. But Zen alone did not create Bushido. For that, another philosophy stepped in, one that was far less mystical and far more structured: Confucianism. Confucian order and social discipline. If Zen taught the samurai how to control their minds, Confucianism taught them how to behave in society. Confucian philosophy originated in China centuries earlier and focused heavily on social harmony, hierarchy, and duty. In simple terms, it argued that society functions best when everyone clearly understands their role. Rulers rule, parents guide, children obey, subjects remain loyal. Everyone fulfills their responsibilities, and chaos is avoided. Naturally, this idea was extremely attractive to rulers, particularly military rulers trying to maintain order across a complex society. When Confucian ideas spread into Japan, they blended neatly with existing samurai values. Loyalty to your lord became the central pillar. A samurai did not simply work for his master, he owed him absolute devotion. Not partial loyalty, not situational loyalty, absolute loyalty. If your lord made a terrible decision, you followed it anyway. If your lord ordered a hopeless defense, you carried it out. If your lord fell from power, you remained faithful even in defeat, because personal judgment was secondary to duty, which, if you think about it, creates a remarkably stable chain of command. It also creates the potential for spectacular disasters, but stability was the priority. Confucian ethics also reinforced discipline, respect for elders, and strict behavioral codes. Samurai were expected to act with composure at all times. No drunken public outbursts, no uncontrolled anger, no emotional breakdowns. A warrior represented not only himself, but his lord and his ancestors, which meant personal conduct carried enormous weight. Even small mistakes could damage reputation, and reputation in samurai society was everything. The slow formation of Bushido. Here is an important detail many people misunderstand. Bushido was not written down as a single official code during the early samurai era. There was no medieval document titled the Official Samurai Rulebook. Instead, Bushido evolved gradually through stories, through traditions, through expectations passed down from teacher to student. Generations of warriors absorbed values from Zen monks, Confucian scholars, battlefield experience, and clan traditions. Over time, certain virtues kept appearing again and again: loyalty, courage, discipline, honor, self-control, and perhaps most importantly, indifference to death. Not recklessness, but acceptance. A samurai should live as though death is always near, because in their world, it usually was. Battles, assassinations, political intrigue, natural disasters. Life in medieval Japan could end very quickly. So Bushido encouraged warriors to treat death as inevitable rather than terrifying, which, at least, that was the theory. Humans being humans, fear never completely disappears, but Bushido created a powerful cultural expectation. A samurai must never show it, even in the worst circumstances, especially in the worst circumstances. Discipline in daily life. Bushido was not just about dramatic moments of battle. It shaped ordinary life too. Samurai were expected to maintain physical and mental discipline every day, training with weapons, practicing horseback riding, studying strategy, learning literature and philosophy. Yes, literature, because by the later medieval period, many samurai were expected to be both warriors and educated gentlemen. A respectable samurai might read Chinese classics in the morning, practice swordsmanship in the afternoon, and write poetry in the evening. It sounds strangely balanced until you remember the sword was never far away, and sometimes that sword would be used for something deeply ritualistic, something that outsiders find difficult to understand. Seppuku, ritual suicide. Now, this practice deserves careful explanation, because in Bushido philosophy, seppuku was viewed as not despair. It was seen as an act of ultimate responsibility. If a samurai failed his duty, if he dishonored his lord, if capture by enemies became unavoidable, he could restore his honor through ritual death. The ceremony followed strict rules: witnesses present, formal clothing, a written death poem, and a composed demeanor, which is an extraordinary level of psychological control. The Age of Endless War, Sengoku Samurai, and Brutal Reality. The year is somewhere in the late 1400s. The rain is falling again. It often is in Japan, especially during the long, humid seasons when clouds roll in from the sea and settle over the mountains like a heavy gray blanket. Tonight, the rain taps steadily against the wooden roofs of a hilltop castle, sliding down dark tiles and dripping from the carved dragon heads that decorate the corners. Below the castle walls, torchlight flickers across muddy fields. Men move quietly through the darkness, thousands of them. Some carry long spears, others carry bows wrapped carefully in cloth to protect the strings from the rain. Horses snort impatiently in the cold air, while armored riders adjust their helmets beneath wide straw cloaks. The banners flap softly in the wind, a single symbol repeated over and over across the army, a clan crest. Somewhere in the shadows, a war drum thumps once, slow and low, like a distant heartbeat. Tomorrow, when the rain stops, these men will try to kill each other, because Japan has entered what historians politely call the Sengoku period, which translates quite directly to the Age of Warring States. And if that sounds dramatic, that's because it was. For roughly a century and a half, from the mid-1400s until the early 1600s, Japan became a battlefield of shifting alliances, betrayals, sieges, and ambitious warlords attempting to carve out their own kingdoms. Central authority collapsed, the shogunate weakened, and suddenly dozens of powerful daimyo, regional lords, began competing for dominance. Imagine medieval Europe during its messiest feudal conflicts, then condense it into a chain of mountainous islands where travel is slow, politics are personal, and everyone has access to trained warriors with swords. Yes, things escalated quickly. For the samurai, this period was both a proving ground and a nightmare, because all the elegant philosophies of Bushido, all the talk of honor, loyalty, and stoic discipline, would now collide with the chaotic reality of war. And reality, as it tends to do, was not always polite enough to follow philosophical rules. War without end. During the Sengoku era, conflict was not occasional, it was constant. Castles were attacked, rebuilt, expanded, and attacked again. Entire provinces changed hands multiple times within a single generation. Farmers were forced into military service, villages burned during campaigns, and roads became dangerous corridors of moving armies. For samurai, warfare was no longer a rare test of skill. It was a profession practiced year after year, campaign after campaign. Some warriors spent decades marching across mountains, sleeping in wet armor, and eating whatever rice happened to survive the journey. Battles themselves were rarely as clean and dramatic as later legends suggested. Hollywood sometimes shows samurai dueling gracefully in open fields while cherry blossoms drift through the air. Reality looked more like organized chaos. Archers firing volleys across muddy ground, spearmen pushing into tight formations, warriors shouting commands while trying not to slip on wet grass, smoke from burning buildings drifting across the battlefield, confusion everywhere. And occasionally, yes, moments of individual heroism, but far more often, survival depended on discipline and numbers. The romantic image of a lone swordsman defeating dozens of enemies is, well, entertaining, but actual warfare favored groups, lines of infantry, units of spearmen, coordinated attacks. The samurai were still elite warriors, but they increasingly fought as commanders within larger armies rather than isolated duelists, which meant Bushido had to adapt. Because loyalty to a lord sounds simple in theory, but Sengoku politics were anything but simple. Loyalty in a world of betrayal. In a perfectly ordered Bushido world, loyalty was absolute. A samurai served his lord until death. Simple. Except Sengoku politics were anything but simple. Alliances shifted constantly, lords were assassinated, castles fell overnight, and many samurai suddenly found themselves without masters. These masterless warriors became known as ronin. The word literally means wave man, like a drifting wave on the ocean. No anchor, no master. Some ronin remained loyal to the memory of their fallen lord, refusing to serve anyone else. Others, well, they needed to eat, so they joined new clans or became mercenaries or wandered the countryside offering sword skills in exchange for employment. This created a strange tension in samurai culture. Bushido praised unwavering loyalty, but survival often required flexibility. And as you might imagine, philosophers writing about honor tend to prefer the romantic version, but the battlefield usually writes its own rules. Castles, strategy, and the rise of daimyo power. As wars intensified, military strategy evolved rapidly. Castles became central to warfare. Early Japanese fortifications were often simple mountain strongholds, but during the Sengoku era, they transformed into massive defensive complexes. Stone walls, layered gates, watchtowers, moats. Entire towns developed around these castles, forming administrative centers for powerful daimyo. From these strongholds, warlords controlled farmland, collected taxes, trained soldiers, and planned campaigns. The daimyo themselves became fascinating figures. Some were brilliant strategists, others were ruthless opportunists. A few were, let's say, creatively ambitious. Take Oda Nobunaga, for example. Nobunaga was one of the most influential warlords of the late Sengoku period, and he possessed a rather unusual combination of traits: military genius, political cunning, and a complete lack of patience for tradition. While many samurai still valued formal duels and ritual combat, Nobunaga focused on efficiency. Victory mattered more than elegance. If something worked, he used it. And one of the things that worked extremely well was something that had recently arrived from Europe: firearms. when gunpowder met Bushido. Portuguese traders landed in Japan in 1543, bringing with them a new weapon, the matchlock musket. At first, it must have seemed a curious foreign device, a noisy metal tube that produced smoke and thunder when fired. But warlords quickly recognized its potential. Unlike bows, muskets required far less training than bows. A peasant soldier could learn basic musket use in weeks rather than years. And when deployed in organized volleys, these weapons could devastate charging armies. Some traditional samurai disliked the idea. After all, firearms seemed to reduce the importance of individual swordsmanship and archery, but Nobunaga embraced them enthusiastically. During the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his forces used rows of musketeers firing in rotating volleys to crush a cavalry charge by the Takeda clan. It was a turning point. Gunpowder had arrived, and Bushido would have to coexist with it. Which raises an interesting philosophical question. What happens to a warrior code built on personal combat when warfare becomes increasingly mechanical? Well, it adapts. Slowly, reluctantly, but it adapts. Life between battles. Between campaigns, samurai life was not always dramatic. There were long stretches of waiting, guarding castles, supervising farmers, training younger warriors, practicing calligraphy or studying military strategy texts. Yes, even in the middle of the most violent century in Japanese history, samurai were expected to cultivate intellectual discipline, because Bushido emphasized balance, strength of body, strength of mind. A warrior who could not control his emotions or think clearly was considered dangerous, not just to enemies, but to his own allies, which meant discipline remained central, even when war grew messy, even when politics turned brutal. And brutal they often did, because Sengoku warlords were not always noble figures. Some were ruthless beyond imagination. Villages were destroyed to starve enemy territories. Prisoners were sometimes executed publicly. Betrayals occurred frequently. The romantic Bushido ideal of honorable combat sometimes collided headfirst with the practical need to win. And when those two forces met, practicality often won, because history. Tokugawa peace, when warriors became bureaucrats. The morning after a war can feel strangely quiet. Not peaceful exactly, more like the world has exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Mist hangs low over the fields of Sekigahara. The grass is bent where thousands of soldiers stood only hours before. Broken spears lie scattered in the mud. Torn banners cling to the damp earth like exhausted ghosts. Crows circle above the battlefield. They have already arrived. Because on October 21st, in the year 1600, one battle quietly decided the future of Japan. The Battle of Sekigahara. Armies representing dozens of rival clans collided in a single chaotic confrontation. Alliances shifted mid-battle. Some commanders betrayed their partners. Others hesitated just long enough for everything to collapse around them. And when the fighting finally ended, one man stood victorious: Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, Ieyasu was not the loudest warlord of the Sengoku period. That title probably belonged to Oda Nobunaga, whose personality had all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Nor was Ieyasu the most flamboyant strategist. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had already dazzled Japan with military brilliance and political maneuvering. But Ieyasu had something even more dangerous: patience. The kind of patience that lets a man wait decades for the exact moment when history tilts slightly in his favor. And after Sekigahara, that moment had arrived. 3 years later, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was officially named shogun, military ruler of Japan. From his new capital in Edo, a city that would eventually become modern Tokyo, he established a government that would dominate Japan for more than 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa Shogunate. And with it came something Japan had not experienced in generations: stability. The end of chaos. For people living through the early 1600s, the sudden absence of war must have felt almost unreal. For over a century, entire regions had been locked in near constant conflict. Children grew up fearing the distant rumble of armies marching. Castles changed hands so often that local farmers sometimes struggled to remember which banner they were supposed to salute. Now, suddenly, the battles stopped. Tokugawa rule enforced strict political control over the daimyo, the regional lords who had once fought endlessly for territory. Each daimyo was required to maintain loyalty to the shogunate through a carefully designed system of surveillance, obligations, and subtle pressure. One of the most famous policies was sankin kotai, or alternate attendance. Under this rule, daimyo had to spend every other year living in Edo, the shogun's capital. Their families remained there permanently, essentially serving as well-treated hostages, which, if you think about it, was a rather elegant way to prevent rebellion. If a daimyo decided to start a war, his wife and children were conveniently located in the shogun's city. As you might imagine, most lords decided rebellion could wait. The roads filled not with armies, but with elaborate traveling processions as daimyo and their retainers moved between their domains and Edo. Caravans of samurai marched through villages carrying banners, armor, and ceremonial weapons. Warriors still existed, but the war itself had disappeared. And that created a very strange situation for the samurai class. A warrior without war. For centuries, samurai identity had been built around combat, training, campaigns, sieges, honor earned on the battlefield. Now, those battlefields were quiet. Tokugawa government actively discouraged warfare between clans. Peace was not just preferred, it was enforced, which meant thousands of professional warriors suddenly found themselves with administrative responsibilities. Yes, the famous samurai swordsmen of Japan slowly became something else entirely. Government officials, tax administrators, city magistrates, record keepers. Some samurai managed irrigation systems for rice fields. Others oversaw legal disputes between merchants and farmers. Many spent long days copying documents, collecting taxes, and reporting economic conditions to regional authorities. It was not exactly the heroic image of a warrior charging across a battlefield beneath fluttering banners. Instead, imagine a man trained since childhood in swordsmanship, now sitting in a wooden office, carefully reviewing agricultural production reports. History has a sense of humor like that. But the transformation served a purpose. The Tokugawa government needed a disciplined ruling class capable of maintaining order across the country. And the samurai, thanks to centuries of Bushido philosophy, were uniquely suited to the task. They were trained to obey hierarchy. They valued duty over personal ambition. They accepted rigid discipline as normal. In other words, they made excellent bureaucrats. The sword that became a symbol. Even though samurai were now administrators, their status remained distinct. They were still the ruling class. Only samurai were allowed to carry the daisho, the long paired swords consisting of a long katana and a shorter wakizashi. These swords were no longer everyday battlefield weapons. They had become symbols, visual reminders of authority and social order. A samurai walking through a town carried not just weapons, but a centuries-old identity. Farmers bowed as he passed. Merchants stepped aside. The sword represented the entire Bushido tradition, loyalty, discipline, and readiness to defend the social structure. But interestingly, most samurai rarely used their swords in combat during the Tokugawa era. Instead, duels, training exercises, and ceremonial displays kept martial traditions alive. Swordsmanship schools flourished. Masters developed intricate styles and techniques, refining movements that had once been practical tools of war into almost artistic expressions of discipline. The battlefield had vanished, but the warrior spirit continued through ritual and training. A culture of discipline. Bushido did not disappear during the Tokugawa period. In fact, it became even more formalized. Philosophers, scholars, and samurai writers began documenting the values that had previously been transmitted through tradition and stories. Texts discussing loyalty, honor, courage, and discipline circulated among the samurai class. Confucian ethics became particularly influential during this time. The Tokugawa government promoted Confucian teachings because they reinforced social hierarchy and obedience. Every person had a role. Samurai ruled, farmers produced food, artisans created goods, merchants handled trade. Each class remained in its place. Mobility between classes was rare. The system was rigid, but stable. And stability is exactly what the shogunate wanted. For the samurai, this meant maintaining personal discipline even in the absence of war. Daily life might involve administrative duties, but mental training continued. Meditation, literature, calligraphy, strategy studies. A respectable samurai was expected to be cultured as well as capable of violence. Yes, it's an unusual combination. A man who might spend the morning writing elegant poetry about falling snow and the afternoon practicing sword techniques designed to cut through armor. But that balance became central to the Tokugawa vision of Bushido. The psychological weight of honor. Even without constant warfare, honor remained deeply important. A samurai's reputation could determine his entire future. Losing face publicly, behaving dishonorably, or failing in official duties carried serious consequences. In extreme cases, the old ritual of seppuku still existed. A disgraced samurai might be ordered to take his own life as a way to restore honor to his family. The ceremony remained highly formalized. Witnesses present, carefully written death poems, composed dignity. To outsiders, the practice seemed shocking, but within samurai culture, it reinforced a powerful message. Responsibility never disappeared, even in peaceful times. Even behind administrative desks, Bushido demanded accountability to the very end. Cities, commerce, and a changing Japan. While samurai adjusted to their bureaucratic roles, Japan itself was quietly transforming. Cities grew larger, trade expanded, merchant families accumulated wealth through commerce, and this created a subtle tension within the Tokugawa social order. Because, according to the official hierarchy, merchants ranked near the bottom of society. They produced nothing directly, they simply moved goods and money. But in reality, successful merchants often became extremely wealthy. Meanwhile, many samurai, seppuku, loyalty, and the dark psychology of honor. Night settles slowly over Edo. The city is quiet in the way large cities sometimes become quiet after midnight. Lanterns burn low along narrow wooden streets. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rings once, then fades into the heavy stillness of early morning. Inside a small residence, a group of men kneel in formal silence. Tatami mats cover the floor. The air smells faintly of incense and polished wood. Candles flicker gently, casting long shadows against the paper walls. In the center of the room sits a samurai. His posture is perfectly straight. His hands rest calmly on his knees. His robe is carefully arranged, white and ceremonial. In front of him lies a short blade placed across folded cloth. No one speaks. A witness clears his throat quietly and reads a document aloud. The words are formal, almost administrative, a statement confirming that the samurai before them has been ordered to perform seppuku, ritual suicide. Outside the house, the city continues sleeping, unaware that a man's life is about to end according to one of the most psychologically complex traditions ever embedded in a warrior culture. And to understand why this practice existed, we have to step carefully into the strange moral universe of Bushido. Because within that world, death was not simply an ending. Sometimes it was considered a correction. Honor above survival. In many societies, survival is the highest instinct. Protect your life, avoid danger, escape when things go wrong. Perfectly reasonable goals, really. Bushido approached the question differently. According to samurai philosophy, honor mattered more than survival. A warrior's reputation reflected not only his personal conduct, but also the dignity of his family, his ancestors, and the lord he served. Losing that honor could stain generations. Failure on the battlefield, public disgrace, disobedience to one's master, or even the humiliation of capture by an enemy. In these situations, the samurai had a final method of restoring dignity. He could take responsibility for failure in the most absolute way imaginable, by ending his own life. Now, from a modern perspective, this may seem shocking or incomprehensible, but inside the logic of Bushido, seppuku served several cultural functions. It demonstrated personal accountability, it preserved family honor, and perhaps most importantly, it allowed a samurai to control the narrative of his own failure. Instead of being remembered as a disgraced coward, he could be remembered as someone who accepted responsibility with courage, which, in a society built on reputation and legacy, mattered enormously. The ritual itself. Seppuku was not performed impulsively. It followed a highly formalized ritual developed over centuries. Witnesses gathered to confirm the act. The samurai often bathed beforehand, symbolically purifying himself. He dressed in white robes traditionally associated with death. A final meal might be served, sometimes sake, sometimes tea, and almost always a final poem. Yes, even in this moment, samurai culture insisted on reflection. The death poem was called a jisei. It usually captured a fleeting thought about nature, impermanence, or the passage of life. A falling leaf, a drifting cloud, a fading moon. Short, elegant lines acknowledging that existence itself is temporary. Then the ceremony began. The samurai knelt before witnesses and took the short blade. The cut, traditionally made across the abdomen, symbolized courage and sincerity. In Japanese belief, the stomach represented the seat of the soul and emotional honesty. But the ritual rarely ended there. A second samurai, called the kaishikunin, stood behind the condemned man. His role was mercy. At the appropriate moment, he delivered a swift beheading strike to prevent prolonged suffering. It required extraordinary precision. Too early, and the ritual lost its meaning. Too late, and the suffering became unbearable. The kaishikunin was often a trusted friend or fellow warrior, which made the entire ceremony emotionally complicated, because the man delivering the final blow might also be mourning the person kneeling before him. Bushido expected both men to maintain composure throughout a process. Stoic, calm, dignified, even in the face of death. The psychology of absolute responsibility. What made seppuku particularly powerful was its psychological message. In samurai culture, mistakes could not always be erased, but they could be answered. Bushido framed failure as something that demanded acknowledgement. A warrior did not blame circumstances. He did not beg forgiveness. He accepted responsibility. This mindset created a social environment where personal accountability carried immense weight. Leaders expected loyalty, warriors expected discipline, and everyone understood that actions had consequences reaching far beyond the individual. Now, to be clear, not every samurai faced this fate. Seppuku was relatively rare in everyday life, but its existence reinforced the seriousness of honor. It acted almost like a moral boundary line. Cross it, and the price might be everything. That possibility shaped behavior long before the ritual itself became necessary. Loyalty taken to extremes. The philosophy of Bushido placed enormous emphasis on loyalty to one's lord. Sometimes this loyalty reached astonishing levels. One famous story from the early 18th century illustrates just how deeply these values were embedded in samurai culture. It involves a group known as the 47 Ronin. Their master, Lord Asano, had been forced to commit seppuku after a political conflict in Edo. His lands were confiscated, and his retainers became Ronin, masterless warriors. According to strict law, the story should have ended there, but these former samurai quietly spent nearly 2 years planning revenge against the official they believed was responsible for their lord's disgrace. Then, one winter night, they attacked his residence. The target was killed. Justice, at least in their minds, had been served, but the Ronin knew their actions violated the law, so they surrendered peacefully. The shogunate faced a dilemma. On one hand, the Ronin had committed murder. On the other hand, their loyalty to their master embodied the highest ideals of Bushido. The solution was predictable. They were ordered to perform seppuku, which they did, all 47. Their graves still exist today, visited by people who admire the extreme loyalty the story represents. It's a dramatic example of how Bushido could push individuals towards acts of remarkable devotion, or remarkable tragedy, depending on how you look at it. Bushido's inner conflict. The philosophy of Bushido contained a subtle contradiction. It demanded loyalty and obedience, but it also praised courage and moral conviction. What happens when those values conflict? What if a lord behaves unjustly? What if loyalty leads to disaster? Samurai thinkers debated these questions for centuries. Some argued that duty to one's master should always come first. Others suggested that a true warrior must balance loyalty with moral judgment. These debates eventually appeared in philosophical writings during the Tokugawa period. One of the most famous works was Hagakure, written by Yamamoto Tsunetsumo in the early 18th century. The book explored Bushido with striking intensity. It famously declared, "The way of the samurai is found in death." Now, that phrase has often been misunderstood. Yamamoto did not mean that samurai should constantly seek death. Rather, he argued that accepting death in advance frees a warrior from fear. Once death is no longer terrifying, a person can act decisively. Courage becomes possible. Duty becomes clear. Still, it's rather a heavy philosophical framework to carry around on a daily basis. Imagine starting each morning reminding yourself that death is always acceptable. That kind of mindset shapes behavior in profound ways. A code at its peak. By the 18th century, Bushido had reached its most refined form. Samurai were scholars. The fall of the samurai and the modern myth of Bushido. In the early morning hours of a summer day in 1853, fishermen near the entrance of Edo Bay noticed something unusual on the horizon. At first, they assumed it was weather. Dark shapes emerging slowly through the mist, heavy clouds perhaps, or distant storm fronts rolling across the sea. But the shapes grew larger and louder. Thick columns of black smoke began rising into the sky. Soon, the outline became clear. Ships, massive ships, iron-sided vessels with towering masts and paddle wheels churning the water like mechanical beasts. To the people watching from the Japanese shoreline, they must have looked almost supernatural. Japan had spent more than 2 centuries under a policy of isolation known as Sengoku. Foreign influence was tightly restricted. Only limited trade through a small Dutch outpost in Nagasaki connected Japan to the outside world. Most Japanese had never seen a Western warship. And these were not ordinary ships. They were American steam-powered gunboats under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. The locals soon gave them a nickname, Kudofune, the Black Ships, because of course they did. And in many ways, those ships carried more than diplomatic letters. They carried the end of the samurai age. When the outside world knocked, Commodore Perry's mission was simple: convince Japan to open its ports to international trade. If persuasion failed, well, the cannons on those ships were very persuasive on their own. The Tokugawa government suddenly faced a terrifying reality. For centuries, Japan had enjoyed internal peace while the rest of the world marched through industrial revolutions, colonial expansions, and technological leaps. Now, modern naval power was sitting just offshore, and the samurai class, for all their discipline and swordsmanship, had very little experience dealing with steam-powered artillery. Imagine bringing a beautifully crafted katana to a conversation about naval bombardment. It was not an ideal strategic position. After months of tense negotiation, the Tokugawa shogunate agreed to sign treaties opening Japan to international trade. And that decision cracked open a door that would never close again. Crisis of a warrior government. The arrival of foreign powers triggered a political earthquake inside Japan. Some leaders believed modernization was necessary to survive. Others insisted the country should resist foreign influence at all costs. The Tokugawa shogunate suddenly looked fragile. Many young samurai began questioning the government's authority. After all, if the ruling system could not defend the country from foreign pressure, what exactly was it good for? Slogans appeared among anti-shogunate activists. Sunno Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The emperor, who had been largely symbolic under Tokugawa rule, suddenly became a rallying figure for political reform, and many samurai joined the movement, which created a rather awkward situation. The warrior class that had protected the Tokugawa system for centuries was now helping dismantle it. History does enjoy irony. The Meiji Restoration. In 1868, the political tension finally exploded. The Tokugawa shogunate collapsed. Power was restored to the imperial court in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. The new government promised rapid modernization, and when they said rapid, they meant it. Within a few decades, Japan transformed itself at a pace that would make even modern policymakers dizzy. Western-style education systems, industrial factories, railroads, modern banking, and perhaps most importantly, a national army. Not a samurai army, a modern conscript army trained with rifles, artillery, and European military doctrine. For the samurai, this was devastating. Their identity had always been tied to military service. Now, the government was building an army that did not require them.
In 1876, the Meiji government officially banned the wearing of swords in public. A small policy on paper, but symbolically enormous. For centuries, the sword had been the visible mark of samurai authority. Now it was gone, just like that. Imagine telling an entire warrior class that the object defining their identity is suddenly illegal. You can imagine the reaction. The Last Samurai Rebellion. Not all samurai accepted these changes quietly. In 1877, a rebellion erupted in southern Japan, led by one of the most respected warriors of the era, Saigo Takamori. Saigo had originally supported the Meiji Restoration, believing modernization would strengthen Japan, but he later became disillusioned with the rapid abandonment of traditional samurai culture. So he did something that probably seemed perfectly reasonable from his perspective. He led a revolt. Thousands of former samurai joined him in what became known as the Satsuma Rebellion. They fought with swords, rifles, and the lingering belief that Bushido still had a place in Japan's future. The government responded with its modern army, artillery, machine guns, disciplined infantry units trained in Western tactics. The result was tragically predictable. After months of fighting, Saigo's forces were crushed. The rebellion ended in September 1877. Saigo himself died on the battlefield, and with his death, the samurai era effectively came to an end. A warrior class that had shaped Japan for nearly 7 centuries disappeared within a single generation. The strange afterlife of Bushido. But something curious happened after the samurai vanished. Their philosophy didn't disappear. In fact, Bushido began transforming into something almost mythological. Writers, historians, and political thinkers started romanticizing the samurai past. Stories emphasized loyalty, courage, and noble sacrifice. The darker realities of Sengoku warfare, political betrayal, and social rigidity were often softened or ignored. Bushido became less of a historical code and more of a national symbol. One influential book published in 1900 helped spread this idea internationally. Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Nitobe Inazo. The book described Bushido as the ethical foundation of Japanese culture, comparing it to European chivalry. Western readers loved it. The idea of stoic, sword-wielding philosophers appealed strongly to the global imagination. Of course, historians later pointed out that Nitobe's version of Bushido was, let's say, heavily polished. The real samurai experience had been far messier, but myths often travel farther than complicated truths. Bushido in the modern world. During the early 20th century, elements of Bushido were adapted again, this time for national ideology. Military leaders encouraged soldiers to embrace self-sacrifice, loyalty, and unwavering duty. Concepts originally associated with samurai honor were reframed as patriotic virtues. This interpretation played a controversial role during Japan's militaristic expansion before and during World War II. After the war, Japan went through another profound transformation. The country adopted a pacifist constitution, military culture was dramatically reduced, and Bushido gradually returned to a more symbolic role. Today, the samurai exist primarily in history books, films, literature, and cultural memory. Their code still fascinates people around the world, partly because it speaks to something timeless, the human search for meaning in duty, the desire to live with discipline and purpose, and perhaps the quiet hope that courage might still matter in complicated times. The quiet echo of 7 centuries. If you walk through certain temples in Japan today, you might find rows of old stone graves, weathered markers covered in moss, names carved centuries ago. Many of them belonged to samurai, men who once carried swords through muddy battlefields, men who later governed peaceful towns, men who wrote poetry about falling leaves while practicing the art of war. Their world vanished, but the ideas they wrestled with never really disappeared. Honor, duty, responsibility, loyalty. These questions remain part of the human story, and perhaps that's why the samurai continue to fascinate us, because their code was never really about swords. It was about how a person chooses to live, or sometimes how a person chooses to die. And as the lanterns dim in the quiet streets of old Edo, now Tokyo, the echo of that ancient philosophy still drifts.
A final reflection: why the samurai spirit still shapes Japan. It is late evening in Kyoto. The streets are quiet in the way only very old cities can be quiet. Lantern light spills softly onto narrow stone paths. Wooden houses lean gently toward the road, as if listening to the footsteps passing below their windows. Somewhere nearby, wind moves through a grove of bamboo. The sound is soft, almost like distant rain. If you wander through these streets long enough, you begin to feel something unusual about Japan's past. Not something loud or dramatic, not the kind of history that shouts through monuments or massive statues. Instead, it lingers quietly, in manners, in rituals, in the way people bow slightly when greeting each other, in the careful precision of a tea ceremony, in the disciplined silence of a martial arts dojo. None of these things are samurai practices exactly, but the echoes are there. Because while the samurai themselves vanished more than a century ago, the philosophy that shaped them did not disappear with their swords. It simply adapted. The invisible code. Bushido was never just about warfare. At its core, it was about behavior, about how a person should carry themselves when no one is watching, about discipline, about responsibility, about placing duty above personal comfort. Those ideas became deeply embedded in Japanese culture over the centuries, not through official laws, but through social expectations. For example, consider the Japanese concept of giri. Giri roughly translates to a sense of duty or obligation toward others, a responsibility to fulfill social roles properly, to repay kindness, to honor commitments. Sound familiar? It should. Giri echoes many of the same moral principles that define Bushido. Similarly, the idea of ganbaru, persisting through difficulty with determination, also reflects the samurai emphasis on endurance and mental strength. Even modern Japanese workplaces sometimes echo these cultural values. Long hours, group loyalty, personal sacrifice for collective success. Now, of course, modern society is far more complex than medieval warrior codes, but the cultural DNA of Bushido still circulates quietly beneath the surface. Discipline as identity. One of the most visible legacies of the samurai spirit appears in Japan's approach to discipline and mastery. Across the country, you can find people practicing arts that trace their origins directly back to samurai traditions. Kendo, Aido, Kyudo. These martial arts preserve techniques once used on battlefields, but they are not taught primarily as combat skills today. Instead, they emphasize character development, focus, self-control, respect for opponents. A student learning kendo may spend years practicing basic strikes and footwork before ever competing seriously. Which, if you think about it, sounds suspiciously like the old samurai training philosophy. Master the fundamentals, control the mind, accept that perfection takes a lifetime. The same mindset appears in other areas of Japanese culture as well. Craftsmanship, architecture, cuisine, tea ceremony. Each discipline values patience and long-term dedication. The idea that skill should be pursued not for quick reward, but for lifelong refinement.
That attitude would have felt very familiar to a Tokugawa-era samurai polishing his sword or practicing calligraphy in the early morning. The global samurai myth. Outside Japan, the samurai have taken on an almost mythical status. Films, novels, and video games often portray them as noble warrior philosophers walking through mist-covered landscapes with perfect moral clarity. Which, to be fair, makes for excellent storytelling. But real history, as we've seen throughout this long journey, was far more complicated. Samurai could be disciplined and honorable. They could also be ruthless, political, and deeply human in their flaws. Bushido was not always a pure moral code. Sometimes it justified extreme violence. Sometimes it demanded loyalty even when loyalty led to tragedy. Sometimes it placed unbearable pressure on individuals trying to live up to impossible ideals. And yet, even with those contradictions, the samurai story still resonates. Perhaps because every culture searches for examples of people who try to live by principles larger than themselves, even if they sometimes failed, especially when they failed. The modern transformation of honor. In contemporary Japan, honor no longer means drawing a sword or facing enemies on a battlefield. Instead, the concept has evolved into quieter forms of responsibility, doing one's job well, respecting others, maintaining social harmony, avoiding behavior that causes embarrassment or disruption. These values are not unique to Japan, of course, but the historical roots linking them to Bushido give them a distinctive cultural flavor. You can see it in moments of crisis. For example, after natural disasters, international observers often notice the calm orderliness of Japanese communities, people standing patiently in line for supplies, volunteers organizing relief efforts, neighbors helping each other rebuild. Those reactions reflect a long tradition of collective responsibility, a belief that personal dignity comes from fulfilling one's role within the group. It is not samurai culture in a literal sense, but the philosophical ancestry is difficult to ignore. The quiet power of memory. Walk through Tokyo today and you will see one of the most technologically advanced cities in the world. Neon lights, high-speed trains, skyscrapers rising above crowded intersections. Yet scattered throughout the city are quiet reminders of the past. Shrines, castle ruins, museums filled with armor and swords once carried by warriors centuries ago. Tourists photograph the artifacts. Students study them in history classes. Filmmakers recreate them on screen. Each generation rediscovers the samurai in its own way, not because society wants to return to that era, but because the questions Bushido asked remain strangely relevant. What does loyalty mean? How much should we sacrifice for duty? What responsibilities do we owe to others? How do we face failure with dignity? These questions do not belong to medieval Japan alone. They belong to everyone. The long echo of Bushido. 7 centuries is a long time for any cultural idea to survive. Empires rise and collapse in shorter spans. Entire civilizations disappear. Yet the samurai spirit, in one form or another, continues drifting through Japanese cultural landscape. Not as a rigid code, not as a commandment carved in stone, but as a memory. A set of stories and values that still influence how people think about discipline, courage, and responsibility. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Bushido. Not the swords, not the battles, not even the dramatic rituals of honor, but the quiet belief that life gains meaning when we commit ourselves to something larger than comfort or fear. A final quiet thought. Imagine a samurai walking through Edo at night 300 years ago, his sandals tapping softly against the wooden street, a sword resting at his side, his mind full of responsibilities to his lord, his family, his ancestors. He could have never imagined modern Tokyo, the bullet trains, the glowing skyscrapers, the millions of people moving through the city every day. But if he looked closely, he might still recognize certain things. The discipline, the politeness, the quiet determination in the way people approach their work. Not the same world, but not entirely unfamiliar either. History rarely disappears completely. Sometimes it simply changes shape. And somewhere between the rustle of bamboo leaves in Kyoto and the hum of a Tokyo subway station, the distant echo of the samurai still lingers, soft, patient, almost like a whisper carried through time. A reminder that the past, no matter how distant, still walks beside us, if we choose to listen.